It's November the 18th, 1988, a sleepy Friday afternoon near a place called Penley, Clwyd in Wales. 15-year-old schoolgirl Anna Humphries is walking home from school, unaware that 31-year-old convicted sex offender David John Evans is lurking nearby. Within a heartbeat, unspeakable horror unfolds. Let's look at the tragic details. Today's case, like many others that I've looked into, was very disturbing to research. But it does raise several issues which I think are worthy of note and of discussion. I'm going to talk more about those issues towards the end of the video, so I'd ask that you stick with me because I'd like your input on them. But before that, let's look at the details of this terrible case. David Evans was a farm labourer from a place called Bettisfield in Wales, and he had a criminal history of violence spanning more than a decade. In July of 1978, he was jailed for 5 years for no less than 3 separate sexual assaults. He was subsequently paroled, but by November 1980, while he was on parole, he was again convicted of the violent rape of a 14-year-old girl. This time, because of the brutal nature of his assault and the fact that he was a repeat offender, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, thanks to early release guidelines and possibly good behaviour, he walked free in 1988, earlier than his normal release date. This would be just 6 months before the brutal crime that he committed against Anna Humphries. On a quiet country lane near Penley, Clwyd, Evans snatched Anna Humphries while she was on her way home from school, and he forced her into his car. When questioned later, Evans said that he committed this crime due to an impulse which he either failed to control or simply could not control. But police and onlookers thought he had far darker motives. At the point where he abducted Anna, she was very much still alive, and she was fighting back and struggling. So strong was her struggle that the car's windscreen was shattered from the inside. We don't know whether she kicked it, whether she was thrown against it. All we know was that the windscreen was shattered. Evans drove on for a while, but eventually he stopped, and this was the point at which he strangled Anna. It's thought that he either did this manually with his own bare hands, or there's a possibility he may have used a double-knotted ligature. At any rate, by whatever means, Anna's life was snuffed out in the middle of the journey. Police thought that once he had stopped the vehicle, Evans had tried to rape Anna, and it was during the commission of this crime that he strangled her to death. But what we do know is that after this, he put Anna's lifeless body in the boot of his car, and the callous sequence continued. He drove to a local garage and just coolly and calmly he got his windscreen replaced. He said basically he'd had an accident and the window needed replacing. Little did the garage people know that Anna's lifeless body was in the back of his car. After this he navigated and drove approximately 40 miles to a place called Hampton Lode in Shropshire. Hampton Lode is a small hamlet situated on the eastern bank of the River Severn. And this is significant because it was in the River Severn that Evans dumped Anna's body. Because Anna had gone missing on her way home from school, police launched a massive search. But during the time they were searching for her, as we know, she was already dead, and it was during this that Evans made his escape. He fled the country, crossing over into France. But Evans' own mother, when she heard of Anna's disappearance, was suspicious. And because of this, she decided to tip off police and tell them basically that she suspected her son might have some involvement and tell them what he'd done in the past. And once they received this information, police got a likeness of Evans and circulated it widely, both throughout this country and Europe. Now, based on the circulated photo of Evans, a lorry driver near Lyon in France recognised him, having seen him, and he alerted local police. Days later, Evans was arrested by French police, and after an application by the British police, he was eventually extradited back to the UK. It would eventually be forensic evidence that sealed his fate. Police found his car and examined it, and they found traces of blood in the car which matched Anna's blood type. They also found fibres and a button from her school uniform in the vehicle. They also isolated glass shards which indicated that the windscreen had been broken and replaced, but led them to believe that it had been broken from the inside, probably due to some violent struggle. Evans went to trial for murder at Chester Crown Court in July 1989. His defence was led by Maurice Kay QC. Evans' barrister, Maurice Kay, conceded that Evans had accepted that he was responsible for the murder, but he claimed diminished responsibility. Evans was remarkably frank about it. He admitted, as I've said before, that it was done on impulse, an impulse that he just couldn't control. He mentioned nothing about sexual assault, and he said that he'd just strangled Anna to frighten her, basically. Unfortunately, the strangulation had gone a little bit too far, and he'd killed her. But the prosecutors hit back. They cited evidence of the struggle with the broken windscreen, and they also laid evidence out to the jury of his violent past with a string of sexual assaults for which he had been previously imprisoned. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours, and they brought back a unanimous guilty verdict. As the verdict was read out, applause actually rose in the public gallery. Despite the terrible nature of the crime, I think this reflected public outrage and relief that the killer had been found. The judge sentenced Evans to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 30 years. This was a reflection of the terrible nature of the crime he committed against Anna and his previous string of violent episodes. Anna's parents were naturally devastated, but they were relieved that their daughter's killer had been found and sentenced to a lengthy time in prison. But they did petition the then Home Secretary Douglas Hurd to look into parole laws, especially the ones that governed the early release of prisoners. They felt that had Evans not been released early, that their daughter Anna might still be alive, and this promoted extensive public debate on rehabilitation versus protection of the public. Evans' release early, despite 4 previous sexual assaults, exposed systemic failures in the system, and it did push legislators to re-evaluate remission practices. Anna Humphries was a young teenage girl just walking home with her whole life ahead of her, but in a few seconds that all ended. Her case reminds us that terrible impulses combined with systemic failures can end in unspeakable loss. And perhaps if we truly honour her memory, we must ask, how many more must suffer? And what changes might prevent future tragedy? And these are the points for discussion, which I mentioned right at the start of the video. And I think they are worthy of discussion, so I'd like your input. Sentencing guidelines for the judiciary are set in the UK these days by something called the Sentencing Council. Now, these are a mixture of legally qualified people and some lay people who are involved in social issues. They are generally appointed by the Lady Chief Justice along with the Lord Chancellor. These guidelines are something that courts must follow unless there would be a severe miscarriage of justice by doing so. So perhaps the first question we may ask is, are the sentences severe enough for certain crimes, especially the violent ones like rape and murder? The other thing that we might have to look at is parole. It would seem that quite a few prisoners are being paroled earlier than the normal extent of their sentence. Now, people on parole boards are appointed by the Minister of Justice, but perhaps if people are being released too early, then the guidelines under which they operate need looking at. In bringing up these issues, I actually looked at some recent history, and from what I can see, there have been cases of people who've committed violent crimes like rape, who have been released earlier than some other people who've not committed crimes which involved assault or violence. I'm forced to question myself, and this is just my opinion, why is that? And in my research, I actually found an article in The Independent, which is a well-known UK mainstream newspaper. Now, this is a couple of years old. It does date from 2023. But the article did detail that no less than 59 offenders that year who had been paroled and were being monitored went on to be convicted of murder in just 1 year. Now, from my point of view, it doesn't seem that those people had been rehabilitated. So I'll leave those questions with you. Please join a discussion and leave me your comments below. But in the meantime, our condolences go out to the family and friends of Anna Humphries, a life and a future lost far too early. And on that note, I'll ask you to stay curious and stay safe. And I'll thank you for watching.